COVID-19 has tested our hope and faith as individuals, families, and the country at large. Besides destroying many aspects of our lives, the novel coronavirus has also affected our human rights in many ways. You and the Law, the COVID edition, is a 30-minute weekly television program that focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights in Uganda. The program engages experts to explain the importance of rights-based approaches to the success of any public health response to ensure the respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights amidst the challenges presented by COVID-19. You and the Law, the television program, brought to you by Legal Hub Uganda, taking the law to the last mile in proud association with I4C Africa Hub and House of Talent Television.
Also, in terms of access to justice, it was much later on that lawyers were considered essential workers.
So with all the swag that lawyers have,
with all of it,
at a certain point, border riders were more important than...
Yes, yes. So where there were violations, people were not able to access the services of a lawyer for advice, or even if you want to take on the matter through litigation, it was hard, because then how do you give instructions to your lawyer if your lawyer is unable to move?
You and the Law, the COVID edition. My name is Jonathan Ochom, your host, and today we're privileged to host Ms. Rebecca Atayo, the legal officer at Land Uganda, who's helping us discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on land rights in Uganda and even across the world, recognizing the fact that the pandemic has really hit the country hard and affected so many of the rights of ordinary people in this country. So, Rebecca, we're talking about land rights now and how it's been affected by COVID-19. And you know that for us to have this conversation, then we need to position it from the angle of the obligation that exists on human rights, and maybe specifically land rights in this context. So I thought we could start the conversation by highlighting what are the things that the state, the government of Uganda, should do to protect land rights, and more so in difficult times like this.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan. The state has the obligation to fulfill, or there are basically three kinds of obligations that the state has. The obligation to respect, to fulfill, and to protect the human right to land. If we start with the obligation to respect the right to land, that means the government or the state should refrain from interfering indirectly or directly with the enjoyment of this right. This obligation includes things like refraining from participating in forced evictions, or promoting activities that destroy or arbitrarily deprive citizens of access to land or control over land. But even when it comes to things like compulsory acquisition of land, properly defining what amounts, or the concept of public purpose or public interest,
yes, it's a very
of land,
controversial area.
So so as not to arbitrarily deprive citizens of that right to land, but also recognizing and respecting customary rights or ways and ownership ways of controlling and managing land, and commons of common properties within communities, because they have their particular uses that have been designated to them.
Through culture.
Exactly. Maybe sacred places of worship, grazing corridors. These may look like idle lands, and yet in fact they are commons that are used by these communities for a specific purpose. When it comes to the right to protect, or the duty, to protect people's land rights, so it basically entails protecting people's ability to access, people's ability to use and to control land, and this calls for the state to be able to adopt necessary and effective legislative and policy frameworks that protect people's ability to use.
So in other words, you're saying a state should, put a law to stop me from grabbing your land. Or
Exactly.
something like that.
Or a law that facilitates you to use your land without unnecessary interferences from outside, but also restraining third parties who want to infringe on your right to land or participate in forced evictions. Also ensuring that the rules and mechanisms that have been put in place governing access to land do not operate in a discriminatory manner. And in our case, for example, favoring the elite or those with money or access or nearest to power, as opposed to those who are not, or men and women, because of cultural beliefs and patriarchy, things like that. When it comes to the obligation to fulfill the right to land, states are required to provide and facilitate secure and sustainable access to land. So, for example, in certain countries, they've implemented agrarian reform such that the landless are able to access land.
Some pieces.
Yes, so some pieces of land, so as to be able to sustain their livelihoods, have a source of income, access food, improve food security, but also the examples of refugees who come into the country and are landless.
And you always complain that they are favored by the government.
Yes. So the government has an obligation to fulfill that human right by providing land for them so that they can be able to grow food, derive some form of livelihood from there, also establish a form of housing or shelter on that particular piece of land. So that is government's obligation to fulfill. But also government has the obligation, or the state has the obligation to eliminate all forms of discrimination when it comes to access, use and control of land, and where it actually identifies particular groups that have been marginalized when it comes to that, it has the duty to eliminate or rectify those particular instances. And we've seen that in our case it's being done, we're trying to do it through reform of the succession law, but also Article 21 of our Constitution that provides for freedom from discrimination.
And it's a good recap of really what the state needs to do. But then we're discussing this in the context where we are dealing with a global pandemic, and government was sort of forced to put in place some difficult measures. Could you sort of run us through some of the measures that government put in place? One, to curb the spread of the COVID virus, but at the same time then you could give us your insights on how those measures actually affected land rights in Uganda.
Thank you once again, Jonathan. I think some of the measures, if I may recall correctly, were in the first wave, we had a total lockdown. Total lockdown of the country, not just inter-district travel and whatnot, but we were supposed to stay home, and only essential workers were identified and given stickers to be able to move around and do their work. So that essentially means that a number of government offices, including those that deal with land management and administration, were equally locked. Courts of law were not accessible, except I think for certain criminal matters, and there were also SOPs, standard operating procedures that were put in place. So there was a requirement for social distancing, the number of people who could be within a courtroom or convene in one place was restricted, movement was restricted, you could not move without authorization, so access also was a problem. How did these particular measures affect land rights? I think in terms of land administration, people were not able to access the services of these structures.
Yes, district land offices.
District land offices, ministerial zonal offices were all locked or partially locked. So that means transactions were put to a halt. But even people that were looking for some form of redress where violations had happened could not access these particular offices. Then in terms of security of tenure, we saw an increase in wanton evictions. Every other day in the news we saw
story of
people had been evicted from land, and these were mainly legal evictions because some of them they were not backed by a court order, or where they were backed by a court order, the Chief Justice's directives were not followed to the latter, so they were legal in a sense. Then we also saw that women were disproportionately affected when it still came to security of tenure, because the numbers indicate that more men died as compared to women. And stressing back to patriarchy and culture, women tend to derive their security of tenure on land through a male figure in their family. So that could be a father, that could be a brother, that could be a husband. So when especially women were disinherited, widows, when husbands passed on, they were easily disinherited by their families and chased out of their land.
That sounds like, you know, a controversial position.
Fast stretch.
Yeah, but I mean, it's reality. Men died, so women died. And viewers, I think this is an important point for us to go for a break so that we're able to recap on some of the effects of this virus on land rights. So let's go for a short break. We'll be right back. COVID-19 came and disorganized our economy, brought our health system to its knees, and along the way, affected our rights significantly. This is You and the Law, the COVID edition, here on House of Talent Television. My name is Jonathan Ochom, your host. Welcome back. This is You and the Law, the COVID edition, and today we're joined by Ms. Rebecca Atayo from Lanet, Uganda, to discuss the implications of COVID-19 on land rights in the country. Rebecca, welcome from the break.
Thank you.
Before we broke off, you were still explaining the implications of the coronavirus, especially you analyzing the measures by government and how this has affected land rights in the country. Perhaps you could carry on from there.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think in addition to what we mentioned earlier, people's livelihoods were affected. A number of Ugandans depend on agriculture as a source of livelihood and a source of income. So because they were unable during that period, because of movement was restricted, so they were not able to access markets. Markets were closed. I think even weekly and seasonal markets in districts were all shut down. So they were not able to sell their produce. So even prices, during that period, we saw that prices of food products or food commodities really dunked and was really low.
And matoke was being, sold at 5,000, I think, for a cluster.
A tray of eggs was, I think, it was at its lowest. But also in terms of inputs, it was hard for farmers to access inputs, agricultural inputs, because these were equally closed. So they could not access pesticides, hose and whatnot, even though they were eventually opened up as a form of essential services. There were still movement issues made it hard for them to access this particular service. Then in terms of encroachment of land, many complaints were coming in that people's land had been encroached on, especially where you have absentee landlords, I would say. You live quite a distance from your piece of land. We had people who are encroaching on your land, extending boundaries, and because you don't have the ability to physically access,
go and move over.
Yes, your piece of land, you come and find that the damage has already been done.
Neighbors already erected a perimeter wall.
Yes.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Also, in terms of access to justice, it was much later on that lawyers were considered essential workers.
So with all the swag that lawyers have,
With all of it.
at a certain point, border riders were more important than...
Yes, yes. So where there were violations, people were not able to access the services of a lawyer for advice, or even if you want to take on the matter through litigation, it was hard, because then how do you give instructions to your lawyer if your lawyer is unable to move? So that was one of the challenges in terms of access to justice. But even these other justice mechanisms, for example, the local council courts, it was hard for them to convene. Yeah. One, those courts have capacity issues in terms of both skill and knowledge. They're not properly capacitated to handle. They operate almost like formal courts. If you look at the requirements in the Local Council Courts Act, it's close to how a formal, they are also formal courts, but how the magistrates court would operate, or the high court. So they don't have the capacity, but also because of standard operating procedures, social distancing, you can only convene so many people. What what about summoning your witnesses? Where are they coming from? What if it's quite a distance? Are they able to come? So all those were challenges. And then during this period, we also saw, in terms of property rights generally, we saw that so many buildings were being erected very fast.
I mean, that's an interesting angle, because then when a lockdown, the economy shut down. I wonder how people were able to build or to get money for building, but
we can only speculate on where this money was coming from, because everyone else was crying and complaining that the economy was doing badly, while buildings were coming up at a very fast rate. So a number of these buildings were not following strict building regulation and restrictions. So we've seen what has happened to them.
Seen some of them collapsing recently.
Yes. So I think that was those are some of the effects of the pandemic on land and property rights that I can think of.
I mean, really, from your explanation, you've touched on several aspects. You've talked about food security. You talked about land as a right of its own. You talked about construction industry, and I think that emphasizes or demonstrates the centrality of land in our general setup as a country, the value that land plays in our lives as citizens. But Rebecca, now we're in a phase where, we're still living with COVID, when these times emerging from lockdown after lockdown, reopening and stuff like that. Let's visualize, say, 4 or 5 years from now. We pass over this period and then something else happens. What do we learn from COVID? What can we do best as a country to ensure that the next time we find ourselves in a situation like this, we have adequate measures to protect people's land rights? Because from your explanation, this right has spillover effects on many other rights, and if we are reluctant, if we have not thought through the measures that we put in place from that angle, chances are we could be worsening the situation for citizens in this country. What would you flag off as a few lessons we learn and / recommendations, really?
Thank you again, Jonathan. I think it's important to first of all recognize that the government, this was a novel situation. Yeah. They had never been in this situation before. So
some people argue that we had cholera, we had Ebola.
It was not to this. The extent was different. This was the whole world was from the first lockdown, the whole world was experiencing this for the very first time. So even having, what we were doing was ad hoc, we have to admit.
Just patching things together.
It was a knee-jerk reaction to the circumstances. And I like to believe that government did the best it could given the circumstances.
Rebecca, we could argue that, the virus started in Wuhan. I think that was December 2019. We had enough time to think through. The first case in Uganda was reported. So the knee-jerk reaction for me that argument doesn't fly, because I think what a good time as a country to prepare.
You could argue that for the second lockdown. For the first lockdown, no one ever imagined in 2019 December that the virus affecting Wuhan in China would eventually be here one day.
Deep down in
Yeah, we thought that it would be contained. At some point, we would not have to grapple with the same challenges that Wuhan was grappling with. But lo and behold, it got us here. So what lessons or recommendations can we learn? And hopefully we don't have to go through this again, but what could we learn? Well, I think it's important that government, first of all, when it's dealing with issues to do with land and land rights, it's important to center people's needs, people's livelihoods, people's aspirations when it comes to land. Let's not view land just as a commodity or a factor of production that could facilitate us to have economic development or move to middle income status. Yeah. But it should really center people's livelihood in this conversation. Secondly, it's important that when some of these decisions are being made, participation. What stakeholders are you calling to the table from whatever different sectors to consult and see how do these decisions that we are proposing to make affect your sector and how better or how can we better them so that the impact is lessened.
So suggesting people should be told, you know, we're going to lock down the counter. What do you think of it?
I don't think you can call the whole country and consult them on particular matters, but they are representatives of the people. You have the legislature, but you also have technical staff within these ministries.
Local government.
Yes, local government that are able to sit down and assess the impact of particular decisions on a sector. So that's the kind of participation and consultation that we'd like to see happening.
Becky, I have to interrupt you there because you have to go for a break. I will pick on when we return with sort of your parting shots still around the recommendations that need to be done by the government of Uganda in future to deal with such situations. Viewers, you're watching You and the Law, the COVID edition. My name is Jonathan Ochom. Let's go for a short break and we'll be right back.
When it comes to the law, we basically live the law, you know, on a day-to-day basis, you know. Whether it is in your bedroom, there is a law that governs it. If you're married, for example, even if you're single, there could be something touching on the law, because you might be in your bedroom with an underage girl, or you might be with another person's wife, you know. All the things are the law, you know.
If you're a human being, you have rights. Those rights are called human rights. They are examples: the right to health, the right to freedom from torture, that underscores human dignity, freedom from slavery. You're not supposed to be someone's slave.
If you look at our penal code, it sets out another marriage laws. It sets out the persons who can marry and those who cannot marry, right? For example, you can't marry your close relatives. You know, if you did, you'd be committing a crime.
The state is not supposed to tell you who to worship, how to worship, how many times a day. No, you have a right to work. A right to work. You have freedom of association.
Cohabitation for whatever period of time does not make you husband and wife, right? And that is why we emphasize to people that when the relationship is still hot, you know, you must ensure that you do what? Marry.
Yes.
You know?
For human rights to be respected, protected, and fulfilled, relevant government programs must actually work. Medicine should reach hospitals. Oxygen should be there. Health workers should have gloves. Teachers should be present. Now they are mostly absent, and they have left the profession, a good number of them. They are into trading. So things must work. If things don't work, human rights are not respected, are not protected, and are not fulfilled.
COVID-19 has tested our hope and faith as individuals, families, and the country at large. Besides destroying many aspects of our lives, the novel coronavirus has also affected our human rights in many ways. You and the Law, the COVID edition, is a 30-minute weekly television program that focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights in Uganda. The program engages experts to explain the importance of rights-based approaches to the success of any public health response to ensure the respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights amidst the challenges presented by COVID-19. You and the Law, the television program, brought to you by Legal Hub Uganda, taking the law to the last mile in proud association with I4C Africa Hub and House of Talent Television, coming soon.
Welcome back. This is House of Talent Television. You're watching You and the Law, the COVID edition, proudly brought to you by Legal Hub Uganda in partnership with I4C Africa Hub. Today we're discussing the implications of COVID-19 on land rights, and in studio we have Ms. Rebecca Atayo from Land Uganda to help us unpack this. Rebecca, before we went for a break, you were emphasizing the need for participation as a key lesson that should inform future interventions if we find ourselves in such a difficult time. And I thought we could carry on from there to examine, what other ways the government of Uganda can protect land rights when we have a pandemic or in extraordinary times like those that we find ourselves now.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan. I think another way is ensuring that there's accountability, especially where violations have happened.
That's a... Okay.
People want to know that in case someone violates my rights, the state, taking on its duty to protect this right seriously, will bring to book whoever has violated.
So if somebody has grabbed my land and
yes,
in a lockdown especially.
Yes, we're not seeing a number of these people who have especially been engaging in evictions being brought to book. So it appears as if the state is condoning such acts. But even empowering communities to be able to deal with some of these effects within, empowering communities to use their structures to resolve some cases that can be resolved at community level through use of traditional justice systems, through use of the LC court system, which is closest to them. So things such as those. And finally, transparency.
Yes.
Yeah, conducting whatever measures are being done, they should be done in a transparent manner.
By that, you may want to throw in a certain light. What exactly are we dealing with, especially from our angle of what would transparency look like from our context of land rights protection amidst a pandemic like COVID-19?
I think it's important that people know how exactly, for example, you see when people were confused as to how you can get help in this situation, during a lockdown, who do I turn to? So even though they had stipulated that, say, the ministerial zonal offices and the courts were operating mainly for criminal cases, but then who do I turn to? It was not very clear who actors could turn to in case of violations. But also in terms of particular interventions, it was not still transparent. I don't know how to put it, but transparency needed to be, it needed to be clearly...
A bit of information flow.
Exactly. Yeah. Information was not readily available for people.
In other circles, people have been urging that the future lies in technology. People are saying that, we need to, I think, as part of, the COVID response, even the courts attempted to do a bit of, digital services. And even, I know that the Minister of Lands has been working around getting their things digital. How do you look at the role of technology in helping us protect land rights in this situation? What could have been done? What role could technology have played in dealing with the effects of COVID-19 on our land rights?
I think technology is definitely the future. I would agree, because we are moving in that direction. And I think courts try to adopt this the best by having some court cases heard online or digitally. The problem with technology is that it leaves certain groups of a community behind. So it may be discriminatory in a sense because not everyone is up to speed with the technology or even has access to tools that would enable them partake of this technology. So whereas would encourage us to move in that direction, perhaps we should adopt like a two-pronged approach where we use technology where it's convenient to use technology, maybe in urban settings, but for rural settings it may be much harder to implement this.
But as a land rights organization, Land at Uganda, and like you highlighted from the start, you do a lot of advocacy. Is this an area that requires, more advocacy on, and if so, what exactly would you be proposing to the government in that regard?
The area of use of technology?
Yes, for land especially.
Yeah. I think we would start with use simple technology. Start by using something that can easily be understood by a layman. So, for example, use technology to convey messages or important messages around land rights to the community, instead of probably having the message conveyed through a poster or something like that. How about you have some form of let's say talking material, talking book that can talk about this. But also we like the fact that technology is being used for inland administration issues to do with demarcation and mapping. The only issue lies in regulation of the use of this technology. So we support the use of technology and technological advancement. It makes our work a lot easier. It's more efficiently done. But there needs to be, we need to remember to regulate, at the same time include everyone.
Okay. You're passionate about women's land rights as an organization. And I'm wondering, earlier on in your presentation, you talked about death as a result of COVID-19 and how it has created sort of a new cluster of widows in the country, people who have died because of COVID-19. And we're thinking, how best can we prepare for situations like death? I mean, what can a person do in their family to ensure that, when death happens, this is how I protect my loved ones? Because I know that, death is a fact of life, but then when you have a situation like COVID, it could come perhaps earlier than you could anticipate. You could have anticipated. We saw young people, 30s, 20s, 50s, dying. How best can we? Because we're talking about the state mainly, but as individuals, how do we prepare ourselves to protect our land during pandemics like this, but also protect the interests of our loved ones who could be affected if we, passed on?
I think the best way to do this is through writing of wills, because then you dictate in what way, in which your estate will be distributed, who gets what, when, and how. So the best way to protect your family would be write a will. Write a will and follow the proper procedure.
You may want to explain that further, writing a will?
Writing a will basically...
What does it take in practical sense?
There are requirements under the Succession Act that you must follow. It must be attested to. That means you must have at least 2 witnesses.
Who are these? Anyone? A lawyer? A friend?
No, it doesn't have to be a lawyer. Anyone can be a witness to your will. Preferably someone that's not going to benefit from the will, because then it becomes hard to prove this will once you've passed, because they have an interest. So it must be attested to, it must be written, note down and reduce whatever it is that you want to do on pen, on paper. Then it must be dated. You must clearly identify yourself, who you are, where you're from. You must sign this will. So those are some of the stringent requirements that are are required. And preferably keep it in a safe place where family members are not able to access.
So within your house, or you could give it to a friend.
Within your household, it could cause more chaos.
I know some people have been giving this to those who have lawyers, you know, give it to their personal lawyers, others, you know, to a priest.
To a bank for safe custody. So wherever you think it's safe and its contents would not be revealed, that's where you can keep that.
I think that's an important area for perhaps another discussion on another day, because when you talk about wills, the practice of will writing in this country is still a little bit, you know, low and
shrouded by suspicion.
Yes, and many people think that if I write a will, I am inviting death. But I think COVID-19 has showed us that death can happen anytime. There's no designated period, and nobody knows when they will die, and it's just an event that can happen and could be caused by anything else, and we have to prepare, because in this show we've been emphasizing the role of government in protecting human rights, in protecting land and property rights, but at the same time, like Rebecca has indicated, it's important even as individuals to take necessary measures to ensure that our property, our land rights are protected in this period. We're coming to the tail end of the show. They can wonder what your parting shots could be as we sort of wrap up the show.
My parting shots would be, I think we mentioned it, we mentioned them when we were speaking about lessons and recommendations. There is need in whatever interventions we have to curb COVID-19 or perhaps any other pandemic or endemic we may face, is center the rights of people when you're dealing, when you're putting in place interventions. Think about how it's going to affect people's livelihoods. Think about how is their food security. Think about even issues to do with access to justice. But have you centered their rights and their aspirations and needs as well? Yeah, those are my parting shots.
To the policymakers out there, Rebecca makes very strong points. We need to center our interventions on people's lives, on people's rights, because at the end of the day, the role of the state is to protect citizens, is to protect their rights. It's only fair that whatever intervention they put in place is based on the interests, on the rights of the people, because then we'll be able to have interventions or measures or policies that reflect the needs of the people and speak to their aspirations as citizens, which I think gets the buy-in and makes people appreciate why the government exists. With that, we've come to the end of today's edition of You and the Law. In the next episode, we'll be discussing yet another fundamental human right that has been affected by this virus. So tune into House of Talent Television. Keep following us on social media, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. Content is being streamed. And until then, I'll see you.